talking to you guys, you can see from the title, about transitioning to a career in wildlife sciences. So I'll kind of give you an outline and work through the talk, and then when I'm done, I'm going to show you a short video kind of showing you some of the things we do within our program specifically. So give you a brief outline. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, show you kind of how I got starting on my career path, moving into the job that I have now, give you a sample of some of the different careers that you can get with a degree in wildlife sciences, and then also talk to you a little bit about the agency that I work for, the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation. So before we get started on all of this, I kind of wanted to define a term because I'm going to be using it a lot throughout the talk, and it's wildlife management. So what is wildlife management? Do any of you guys hunt or fish at all? Anybody? Yeah? So those animals that you're out hunting and fishing, who do they belong to? Do you know? Any idea? So actually wild animals here in North America are actually owned by everyone. So they're owned by the public. They're owned by you, they're owned by me, and those animals are held in public trust to be taken care of by certain people such as wildlife managers. So Webster Merriam defines wildlife management as balancing the needs of fish and wildlife with the needs of humans using the best available science. So the program that I specifically work for is the Streams program, which is within the Fisheries Division at the Department of Wildlife Conservation. So when I'm talking about wildlife management specifically, that is making sure that there are adequate population sizes. So that means having a lot of a certain species. So when you're going out and hunting white-tailed deer, we want to make sure that there's a healthy population of white-tailed deer out there. And in fisheries specifically, we're managing for kind of game populations of fish like bass and catfish specifically. So if you're going out bass or catfish fishing, we're kind of managing for those populations. The second point would be healthy populations. So in the case of fish, a fat fish is a healthy fish. So we're going out and seeing how healthy those populations are and maybe enacting some kind of rules or regulations that can help keep those populations at higher levels and at healthy levels. And then also, the most important part that I think is making sure those populations persist in the foreseeable future. So not only do those fish and wildlife populations belong to all of us, you and me, but also your kids and your grandkids and future generations that come along. So we're making sure that those populations can persist through time. So kind of moving on into a little bit about myself. So as Britt told you, I do work for the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation right now. And specifically, my position is a streams technician, so that's kind of like a biologist assistant. I did graduate Chaparral in 2009, and if you don't believe me, I have a picture of me and another student taking some water quality samples in Mrs. Faust's advanced biology class. So any of you guys in advanced biology? Yeah, a couple. Nice. Nice. Well, that's kind of some of the inspiration I had to pursue this career field was that class. So. I got my bachelor's at Kansas State University in fisheries, wildlife, and conservation biology. And then I pursued my master's degree in fisheries and aquatic ecology at Oklahoma State University. I got my first job for actually the Missouri Department of Conservation, so it's kind of like KDWP&T here in Kansas, but in Missouri. And then since 2016, I've worked for ODWC. So when I first graduated and I went to Kansas State University, I actually was a political science major. So I was in a major that had nothing to do with what I'm doing right now. So that kind of leads to my first piece of unsolicited advice that I wanted to give you guys. So even if you're not going to pursue a field in a fisheries or wildlife sciences, don't be afraid to deviate from your original plan. So it's great that maybe some of you guys are thinking right now, like, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a lawyer, I want to go work for a tech company. It's great to have a plan, but don't be scared to deviate from that plan because there's a lot of things that you're going to go to school and maybe not even in school and learn about different career paths that you didn't even know were out there that you think would be really great. For instance, my wife went to school as a business major and she learned about speech pathology, which is a whole other field that I didn't know about. So don't be scared to deviate from that plan. So when I got done with my freshman year, I decided that I enjoyed the classes that I was in, and I enjoyed the major, and I was doing all right. I didn't really want any of the jobs that you kind of had to take with that major. So I switched to a fisheries, wildlife, and conservation degree. So the first thing I did after I switched my major was start looking around, and actually there's a professor on campus at Kansas State University whose job it is to do fisheries research, and they were looking for undergraduates to work for technicians in their lab. So actually my first kind of job that I got paid to do as a fisheries major was helping graduate students do research projects, specifically on the Arkansas and the Nenasko rivers that are actually right here in Kansas. Like the Nenasko River, if any of you are familiar with, runs kind of close to Kingman, Kansas. So I actually got to help a graduate student who was from Texas and kind of show him around the area because I was familiar with the areas that we were working in. And so when I got done with my bachelor's degree, you kind of find out that if you really want to be a biologist specifically, you kind of have to go to graduate school. And when I say graduate school, I kind of mean two specific different paths. So the first is a master's degree. So this is typically a 2 to 3 year program. And while this didn't used to be the case, it's really becoming the minimum degree requirement. So if you want to go into this career field, I'd highly suggest pursuing a master's degree. And I know 2 to 3 more years tacked on to another 4. It sounds kind of terrible maybe to some of you, but it's really not all that bad. I'll talk more about graduate school after this. And also, some folks also go for their PhD or their doctoral research degree. So this is an additional 4 to 5 year program, and it's required for a lot of upper level research positions in some state agencies and a lot of federal agencies. So if you're wanting to do fish and wildlife research for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or some of the other federal agencies that I'll talk to you guys about later today, it is really suggested that you get a PhD. But for the most part, a master's degree is pretty sufficient. And then there are some careers that I'll talk about later that you don't even need a master's degree for. So just to kind of give you an idea. But going into some of the perks of graduate school, it really immerses you into the scientific process. So in biology and advanced biology now, you guys are learning about the scientific process and the steps in that process. In graduate school, you're basically working on a project that is all your own, that you're carrying out yourself. And specifically, I was working with larval fish, so that's another name for baby fishes, larval fish communities in the Missouri River. And so that was my project, and that's basically what I studied while in graduate school. And it's not like your bachelor's degree where you're spending all day in classes. You do have a small course load, but for the most part, you're working on your research project. So it's a very flexible degree. So just because I studied fish communities in the Missouri River doesn't mean that I have to get a job studying fish communities in the Missouri River. If you guys graduate with a degree like this, it really gives you the tools to pursue any kind of wildlife-related career that you want. So if I wanted to be a bear biologist and work with black bear populations in northeast Oklahoma, you can make that jump. So just know that you're not pigeonholed into whatever you studied in your master's degree, working with that animal as you move on into your professional career. You also meet a lot of new people and gain experience with other projects. So when I was in graduate school, there were about 5 or 6 other students in my lab who were working with other animals. And so you get to volunteer your time there and learn new skills and meet new people that really come in handy when you start looking for your first job. And also the best part about graduate school is it is free. So any research program that's worth its salt will have funding to bring you on as a student to do a research project, and typically they will waive tuition fees, so you don't have to pay for school, and you're actually getting a small wage to buy groceries and pay for rent and stuff while you're getting your degree. So while it is another extra 2 to 3 years, it's you're not going into debt because of it, so that's pretty great. So it leads me to my next piece of advice. Volunteer, volunteer, and volunteer some more. So even right now in high school and moving on into your bachelor's degree, whatever career field that you're wanting to go into, whether you want to be a physical therapist or whatever, volunteer as much as you can. Call up a professional that's got a job and maybe job shadow them for a day. So you'll learn some of the skills that you might need to pursue that career, and maybe you'll learn that that's not really what you're interested in after all. So that's something that's pretty valuable to do to gain that kind of experience. So for instance, when I was at Oklahoma State, I kind of volunteered with a lot of other students' projects. And so while I was at Oklahoma State, I got to travel to Georgia to work with the National Park Service to work on a fish community project down there. I got to survey a threatened species that we have in Oklahoma with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I even got to travel out to New Mexico to help a student with his project out there. So you get to go and see a lot of places, work with a lot of different new species that you've never seen before, and also learn a lot of skills that you can put towards when you start looking for a career or looking for your first job. So getting into what careers are available to you with a degree in fisheries science. So what a lot of people think of in a fisheries science career would be a biologist. So biologists are really the backbone of a fisheries or wildlife management agency. So A biologist is defined as a student or professional who has specialized knowledge of the scientific study of life. So when I was talking to you earlier about wildlife management, these are the folks who are actually out in the field collecting data and information from those species so that we can put forth recommendations to manage those populations. So for instance, if any of you guys hunt or fish, you know that you have to look into the regulation booklet and see when is deer season, how many deer can I shoot, what can I shoot those deer with, whether it's archery season or rifle season, and how many can I shoot. And all of those recommendations are put in place by biologists who are collecting data on those populations. So typically in most agencies, a biologist is typically pigeonholed into two different categories: an aquatic biologist or a terrestrial biologist. So you're either working with animals that are in the water, or you're working with animals who are on the land. And that kind of sounds like you have either one choice or the other, but actually within those two different disciplines, we hire a lot of different biologists who work with a lot of different systems and a lot of different animals. So we have biologists that are reservoir or lake biologists who are specifically managing different lakes within a region. We have biologists, like in the picture here, that work with one specific species. So that's Jason Schooley. He's our paddlefish biologist. So he's working with just that species. We have streams biologists, so folks that are working in running waters. And then on the terrestrial side, we have folks who specialize in big game, so working with mountain lions and black bears. Upland bird biologists, so they're working with pheasant and quail. And also area managers. So if any of you have ever hunted at a public hunting area, we have biologists whose job it is to take care of the land there and take care of the habitat and take care of the animals on that specific property. So there's a lot of different options. So biologists can mean a lot of different things. But also, specifically our department, we do hire a lot of other support staff and other folks, not just biologists and biologist assistants. So we have information and education specialists, folks that work within our licensing department. We actually do have a law enforcement branch that I'll talk to you guys a little later about, and folks whose job it is to operate heavy equipment for us. So there are a lot of different jobs that you can get within our department specifically that I'll talk to you a little bit later. So you're not just limited to a biologist job. So some of the agencies that you would typically work for with a degree in wildlife sciences. So starting at the federal level, so that you're employed by the federal government, kind of the first thing that a lot of people think of when they think of a federal job in fisheries and wildlife sciences is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So when I'm talking to you about like state agencies like Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation or the Kansas Department of Wildlife Parks and Tourism, they're managing wildlife populations within the state itself. So what happens when we have animals that migrate over state lines? Who's in charge of managing those populations? So that's where the Fish and Wildlife Service steps in. Specifically for some of you that maybe duck hunt, you know that when it starts getting cold, ducks start migrating from Canada and our northern states all the way down to, through Oklahoma and Texas, and those populations are hunted while they're migrating. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is collecting data on how many birds are being killed, and they use that information to make recommendations the next year, like, hey, maybe too many are getting shot, we need to bring the limits back on some of those species, and that's their job. Another big part of their job is working with threatened and endangered species. So some of you may know that, like the bald eagle, this was probably, I think, before I was alive, the bald eagle was listed as an endangered species. So the Fish and Wildlife Service steps in and takes management actions to help protect those species and bring their populations back. And in the case of the bald eagle, it's not on the endangered species list anymore. So they're working with a lot of those rare species. But there's a lot of other federal agencies that you can work for. So like the United States Geological Service, your survey, you're doing a lot of research-specific projects, and all these different agencies. This is just a sample, and I could give a whole presentation about what each of these things do. But the point is, all of these agencies hire folks with a wildlife sciences degree. So the next branch that I'm going to talk to you about are NGOs, or non-governmental organizations. So if any of you are familiar with like Ducks Unlimited or the National Wild Turkey Federation, all those organizations, while specifically are kind of looking into sustainable harvest of ducks and turkeys specifically with these two organizations, they do hire people with fish and wildlife science degrees. Also, we have some advocacy groups and also manufacturing jobs and also consulting firms. So if like the Fish and Wildlife Service is wanting to specifically do some research on, say, mallard ducks, and they don't have the manpower or the time to do it, they'll sometimes hire consulting firms to do the research for them. They also hire people that have degrees in wildlife sciences. And also, like in the case of Sontech, they make scientific equipment. So you'd be manufacturing and creating equipment that folks use in the field while they're collecting data. So they also hire people with a degree in wildlife sciences. And the last kind of segment I wanted to talk to you about are state agencies. So as I said earlier, state agencies are really concerned with managing wildlife and fish populations within their own state. So if you've ever heard the Kansas Department of Wildlife Parks and Tourism, they're Kansas's state wildlife management agency. And then the ODWC is the agency I work for, concerned with populations in the state of Oklahoma. But if you want to work for a state agency, you're not just limited to choices like this. So for example, in Oklahoma and Kansas, we have the Kansas Department of Health and Environment and also the Conservation Commission. So they are more specifically working to make sure we have clean air and water within the state. They also hire people with a wildlife sciences degree. So if you guys are picking up on a theme here, it's a very flexible degree that you can get a lot of different jobs with. So that brings me to my last piece of unsolicited advice that I'm going to give you guys. Really keep in touch with the people you meet throughout school and work, because especially in my career field, it's a pretty small field. So if you have worked with someone, there's a good chance that if you're doing a job interview with someone else, they probably know someone that you already know. So keeping in touch with those people, you can really use those connections to call them up before maybe a job interview and ask them if they have any idea of what the job's like, and kind of give you an idea of what you're going to be getting into, and also how to answer some different interview questions. So that can be a really a good thing to do while you're going throughout school and maybe getting your first jobs. So moving into the Department of Wildlife, or the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation, and what I do at my job. So this is the mission of the ODWC, and it's kind of long and full of jargon. So the part I want you to focus on is the mission of ODWC is the management, protection, and enhancement of wildlife resources. And then if we go down here to future generations and citizens and visitors to Oklahoma. So that last part I was talking to you about wildlife management specifically, the most important part is making sure those wildlife resources we have are available to not only us, but also our kids and our grandkids. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the different divisions that are in ODWC. So one of those divisions is the I&E division, or the Information and Education division. So folks that are hired on in our I&E division are putting together our big game reports, those rules and regulations that you have to go read on before you go hunting or fishing. They're putting those together and printing those up and putting them out to the public. And they also travel to different schools within the state and are teaching kids how to shoot a bow, or maybe shoot black powder rifles, and giving other educational events at schools. So with a degree in wildlife sciences, you could be doing something like that in our I&E division. Our next division is our law enforcement division. So all those rules that you have to follow while you're out hunting and fishing, those are actually enforced by law enforcement officers, otherwise known as game wardens. So if you know that there's a guy out there that's hunting deer out of season, good chance that there's a game warden looking for them. And while some of the violations that you may hear about, like shooting a deer out of season, can come with a pretty hefty fine, there are some things that you can do that would actually land you in jail and get, like, your vehicle, your rifle, or whatever you are using to illegally hunt or illegally fish can be taken from you. So these guys have a lot of the same powers as a regular law enforcement officer. And if you're interested in this career, this is one of those that you don't have to have a master's degree. So keep that in mind if you ever find yourself called to be a law enforcement officer. One of our other divisions is the wildlife division. I kind of talked to you about that earlier. So these people are working with wildlife populations on land. So they're working with black bears, working with white-tailed deer, and also those area managers that I was telling you about are managing habitat for wild animals. So they're planting food plots for deer and quail. They're burning out underbrush in some of our wildlife areas to kind of thin out the underbrush, so hunters and people that like to go hiking and stuff like that can go enjoy the area. And finally, our last division, the one that I work for, is the fisheries department. So in fisheries, kind of the same thing with the area manager, biologist job in the wildlife division. We have folks that are managing fish populations in lakes across the state, and that can be going out and sampling and collecting data that I'll kind of talk to you about here in a little bit. Sinking trees in some of our lakes because fish like to use those as habitat. We have folks that are working with specific fish species like the paddlefish here. And also, if any of you have ever been to Pratt Fish Hatchery, we have a bunch of fish hatcheries in Oklahoma where if you worked there, your specific job would be raising fish from eggs all the way into fingerlings or maybe adults. And we release those and put those fish in lakes, ponds, and rivers and streams across the state for people to catch. So specifically within fisheries, I work for the Streams program. So as you can see from this map here, we are charged with managing fish populations in all running waters across the state. So that can be run from a little dirty creek that you see running through a field, all the way up to the Red River and the Arkansas River, which are our biggest rivers within the state. So I'm going to kind of move through what we do throughout the year at my specific job. So the first thing that we do in the early spring is our catfish population management program. So that's working with catfish specifically. So what we're doing is we're going out and collecting age and growth data. So I'll kind of talk to you about that in a little bit. We're going out and collecting population data. So we're seeing how many fish are out there. And also we're using all of that data to inform fishing regulations. So I'll give you an example here. So we go out, we collect our fish, and I'll show you how we do that with a video at the end. And then we're removing these age structures, so specifically looking at age and growth data, we're removing these little otoliths, which are little bones in the fish's head that you can actually take out in sections. So if any of you have ever counted rings on a tree to see how old that tree is, you can do the same thing with a fish. So every year that fish is alive, it lays a ring down in that otolith. So this catfish specifically, if you count the rings there, you can see that that catfish is about 10 years old. So using that kind of data, we can go out and say, wow, we collected a whole bunch of catfish, but they're all this big and they're all really old. So that must mean that they're having poor growth. So there can be a lot of different reasons for that. Maybe they're overcrowded, maybe they don't have enough to eat, and we can suggest different regulations that can help solve that problem. So maybe we make the bag limit that day where a fisherman, if he goes out, he can keep more of those fish. And if he's keeping more of those fish, that really thins out the population, so there's more food to go around for the remainder, so they get bigger. So that's just an example of what regulation that we can enact to help mold and shape populations. The next thing we do is our fish community monitoring project. So if you see the picture of the state here, we break the state up into different watersheds. So a watershed is simply an area where all the rivers and streams that are running all go to a certain a point or same river. So like in the upper Red River, all these rivers and streams up here are actually flowing down into the Red River. And what we're doing is we usually have about 40 to 50 sites that we sample throughout our fish community monitoring. And what I mean by fish community, I mean we go to a site and we're putting out different sampling gears that I'll show you in a video later, and we're looking at every single species that's present at that site. And we record it. So the reasons we do this is to document species ranges. So how do we know that a fish species is threatened or endangered, or maybe their population's shrinking or they're in trouble? We don't know that unless we're out there sampling. And so that's kind of the main gist of why we're going out there and collecting all this data. We can also track changes in the ranges of those invasive or maybe endangered species. So are any of you familiar with like a silver carp, Asian carp? So have you seen those like YouTube videos of people going down the Mississippi or the Missouri River and you see all those fish jumping out of the water and hitting the boat? Those fish are actually native to China, and somebody brought them in and were raising them in a pond in Arkansas, and they got out, and now they're all over the Mississippi River, all over the Missouri River, and they're spreading to the Red River in Oklahoma. So when we go out and do our fish community monitoring, we can track and see where those species are at, if they're spreading through the state, and maybe if there's some management actions we can take to try to get them out of our rivers and streams because they can hurt some of our native species. We can also compare our contemporary fish surveys, or what we find today, to historical surveys. So there were folks doing fish surveys way back in the 1800s that we can go back and look and see what's changed over time, and maybe if there's something that we're doing as humans that has caused those changes that maybe we can try to reverse and make sure those populations are bouncing back. Moving on into the fall. So another cool thing about the fish community monitoring is you're working with a lot of different species. So in Oklahoma specifically, we have over 174 fish species in the state. And I think Kansas has something like maybe 90 some, if I remember right, something like that. But a lot of these fish aren't found in rare and remote places. So like this red shiner here is a pretty common species, and that's really common here in Kansas. So if you drive over a little dirty creek that doesn't look like there's anything in it, there's a good chance that there's going to be some of these really neat and colorful and interesting species there. So that's another cool part of the job, is you just get to see the diversity that exists throughout the state. And then finally, moving on into the fall, we do our black bass population management. So very similar to the catfish population management, we're collecting age and growth data, population data, and using that to inform fishing regulations on our black bass species, specifically largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, and spotted bass like the one pictured here. And with any field, when it gets cold, it's not all fun and games where we're out in the water playing with fish. We do have to sit down in the winter, write up reports, make presentations like the one I'm giving you guys today, and use all that data that we collected, summarize it, and then use it to make recommendations on what we need to do next year, specifically with those different game fish species like catfish and bass that I was telling you about. So we put forth the recommendation, and then the Wildlife Commission makes a decision whether they're going to enact that regulation change that we suggest. So to give you some kind of pros and cons of this career, one of the big pros to me, it may not be to some of you, is working outside. So a good part of the year I'm outside in the water collecting fisheries data, which is a really big part of why I even switched to this career field. I like being outside. It's also a pretty fulfilling career with a chance to do research with wide-ranging implications. So although I showed you those specific things that we're doing throughout the year, we also get to work with other universities and federal agencies that are doing research on threatened and endangered species. So some of the stuff I'm doing at my job is maybe helping some of those populations bounce back and get removed from the endangered species list. So that's pretty fulfilling to me. You also get to fish on the job a little bit. A lot of folks think that that's all we do, but in some cases, specifically with our black basses, when you're trying to get fish out of really deep water that you don't have any sampling gears that can sample that deep, the best way to get those fish is with rod and reel. So you do get to fish on the job just a little bit. There are some good perks and benefits with this career field. So a lot of state and federal agencies will have pretty good retirement and insurance benefits. And also you get to take a work truck, working for some agencies, home with you every day. So that's another good perk. And you're also doing new things daily. So when I'm at the office and it's kind of a slow day and I've been entering data all day, there are guys that work with wildlife, there are law enforcement officers, all those guys are in our office at the same time. So if a wildlife guy comes down and says, hey, we're gonna go ban some geese, you wanna come along, that happens all the time, and I'm able to go learn about goose banding and other things that some of the other divisions are doing. And actually what becomes the case a lot within our department is if you get a job in fisheries and say you start volunteering a little bit with the wildlife guys and you decide, hey, I want to be a bear biologist, or hey, I want to be a game warden, that can happen pretty easily. So know that when you get your first job, you're not just limited to that first job you got. You can bounce around if you want to, and that actually happens quite a bit. So that really kind of gives you an idea of how flexible this career can be. And with any pros, there are some cons. So, like I said earlier, it does require extra education. Specifically, a biologist job, you're really looking at going and having to get a master's degree, which is that extra 2 to 3 years of school tacked on to your bachelor's degree. It's also a pretty competitive job market. So my last job interview, I was pitted up against like 40 or 50 other people going for this job. So you kind of have to be up on your toes and really do a lot of that volunteering and gaining all those skills that help separate you from other people to get that job. And then sometimes you have to be willing to work in a place where you didn't really want to or expect to be for a while to get that experience to go to the place you wanted to be. So like my first job offer I ever got was in the state of Florida. I'd never been to Florida before, and I wasn't really interested in going all the way to Florida for my first job. Luckily, I got a job in Missouri doing something a little different, but the point is it wasn't my initial plan. But I went there, got the experience I needed, and I used that experience to get a job in Oklahoma working for the Streams Pro to a senior position up there. They usually make pretty good money, but most of the time a biologist is pretty much a working wage, but with good benefits and all the other pros that I was telling you about earlier. So to recap, if you're wanting to go to this career field, or I guess in any career field actually, when you're in middle school and high school, try to volunteer or do some job shadowing. That'll really help you kind of figure out what this person does every day on their job and if that's something that you would want to do. When you move on into your undergraduate degree or your bachelor's degree, obviously you're going to be going into a major that's specific to wildlife sciences, taking wildlife management and science classes, and also another good thing within our field and maybe some other fields to be on the lookout for are internships. So going into my senior year of college, I applied for an internship in Auburn, Alabama, working at the university there. And I got to travel to Alabama and do my own fisheries research project, which really gave me a taste of what graduate school was going to be like. And usually those internships are paid. So you're getting experience, you get to travel, and you get to learn about what it's going to be like on the job and if that's something you want to do. So that's something I would suggest taking a look at. Obviously moving into graduate school, and then those career options that I told you about earlier, state, federal agencies, non-governmental organizations, and maybe if you want to teach wildlife science classes at a college or at a community college, a master's or a PhD can get you there. So if that's something that you feel called to do, that's another route you can take. And also to recap some of that unsolicited advice I gave you earlier, don't be afraid to deviate from your original plan. That can be kind of scary. You know, you've got it set that I'm going to be a doctor and that's going to be that, but you get to school and you decide maybe after a couple job shadowing opportunities that you didn't really want that field. It can be scary to switch, but don't be scared of it. Do all the volunteering you can and keep in touch with those people that you meet in school and throughout your internships and all the other places that you go, because you never know when someone that you're going to be interviewing with may know someone you've already worked with and can kind of give you the inside scoop when you're going into a job interview. And my boss forces us to plug our Facebook group, so if you want to see what we're doing on a daily basis, we do posts every week at ODWC Stream Team, showing some of the sampling events that we're doing and some of the research projects we're working on, if you're interested. And with that, I'll take any questions you guys may have. If you're still thinking of some, I'm going to pull up a video that kind of shows you some of our sampling gears that we use on the job. So this video is pretty short. It's like a 3 to 4 minute video, and it's going to show you when I'm saying we go out and sample catfish and sample bass and do all these things outside. This is some of the gears we use to do that. So this first little segment is going to show you how a trawl net works. So this is what people refer to as trawling. So what you're doing is you're throwing this net off the front of a boat, and then you throw out the otter boards with it that keep the net open, and then you're letting all that line out. And this allows us to sample fish species that are in those really deep habitats that we can't get to with some of our other gears. So we use this a lot with our fish community sampling because there are some fish species that hang out in that deep, fast water that we really can't get to with any of our other gears. The next thing we do is seining. This is probably our most common sampling gear. So it's simply a net with 2 poles on each side. You pull that through the water and you lift it up, and we use that to sample a lot of our smaller bodied fish species in our fish community monitoring. And you take out the fish, you measure it, ID it, do whatever you need to do, whatever information you need, and let it go. So for black bass sampling specifically, in northeast Oklahoma, some of our streams are really clear. So we actually get to snorkel a little bit on the job. And for bass management specifically, one of the most effective ways that's been shown to count numbers of smallmouth bass is actually snorkeling. So we actually go in the water, we're counting the number of adults and counting the number of young years, so that's fish that were born that year, and that gives us a sense of how healthy the population's doing. And we also get to see a lot of the other cool species that frequent our streams in northeast Oklahoma. Boat electrofishing is kind of our most common sampling gear. So it's exactly like it sounds. We're using a generator that's in a boat, and it's pulsing electricity into the water through that anode right there. And what it's doing is actually putting a small little bit of electricity into the water. The fish get stunned, and we net them up. We're able to weigh them, measure them, and it actually doesn't kill the fish. So this is a good non-lethal way to see what's in the river and actually collect bass and catfish. Hoop netting is one of our passive gears, so that's one that we put out, leave overnight, and go back and check it. So this specifically is a net that has all these giant hoops in sequence that have this small throat that you'll see in the middle of it. So what happens is we leave it overnight, fish move at night and swim into the net and can't get out because of those small throats on the front. So we use this a lot for our catfish monitoring. As you can see, we were unsuccessful to get any catfish that day. Got a bunch of suckers, but they swim in the net and can't get out, and this is another good non-lethal way to collect fish. Tow barge electrofishing is probably our second most common sampling gear we use. So it's the same thing as the boat electrofisher, except for it's a generator in a small barge that we use in water that's probably chest deep and more shallow than that. We're pulsing electricity into the water, netting all the fish that we want, and then put them in a cooler on the boat. And then you'll see a video or a segment of the video later where we're measuring the fish because it is stunned by electricity, so that makes them a lot easier to work with. We're measuring them, taking total length, maybe documenting whether it was a male or a female, and seeing how much it weighs. And then we put them in a little tank like this one afterwards to let them recuperate. And after they come to, after they're done being stunned, we let them go and they go back to the stream. So it's another good non-lethal way to sample fish species. I think that's it. So if you guys don't have any questions, Britt has my contact information. Be happy to give you guys my work email if you ever want to ask any questions about the field or anything that I talked about in the presentation today. I'd be happy to answer any questions. So thanks for having me, guys.
Nobody has any questions? Not one. For real?
Where are you based out of?
Where our office is in Porter, Oklahoma, which is like southeast of Tulsa. So we're stuck in the northeast corner, but we're charged with managing the whole state. So we do a lot of traveling, which is kind of one of the perks of the job too.
Is there a lot of IT jobs with this?
Yeah, actually, a lot of federal jobs and state jobs will do hire IT folks. So just like with any career, like all the data analysis and report writing that we have to have computers to do that, and there's problems with those computers, and IT folks work there too. And also we have IT folks, like the video I just made, that was just one we made ourselves, but there's folks that work in I&E that are actually out flying drones and making educational videos.
So like videography?
Yeah. So although you're maybe not as interested in fish and wildlife, you can get a videographer job with the wildlife department. So a lot of different options.
Any other questions? That's a good question, by the way. Any other questions? Okay, well, you guys thank Trevor.